Hey everybody, back again. This is going to be the PowerPoint for Chapter 3. I'm still a little bit sick, but I'm going to try to get through it without losing my voice. So, at the end of Chapter 2, what we were talking about was the English finally starting to create colonies in North America, and we ended with Jamestown being like the very first permanent English settlement that happened. Now, in Chapter 3, we're going to talk about a little bit more of these colonies that are being created. And also, we're really starting to adopt that whole underlying theme with the creation of the colonies, and that's freedom. So most of these colonists coming over had some idea about freedom that they wanted to establish in North America and with these new colonies. At the same time, freedom was sort of going through its own change in England. For a very short time, they did overthrow the monarchy by executing King Charles I and establishing what they called as a Commonwealth, with Oliver Cromwell was the lead of that. It didn't last very long because once Cromwell died, they went back to being a monarchy because they really had no idea how not to be a monarchy. So they asked Charles II to come back as their king. There were some stipulations put in place, but pretty much they went back to being business as usual. The problem was King Charles II had a lot of debts. He had a lot of people that he owed money to. And also, he was coming in as controlling a location that was going through a lot of changes and having a lot of people that were being persecuted at the time, and just a lot of stuff was happening. So he decided that he was going to basically kill two birds with one stone by giving tracts of land to people in North America, one, to pay off his debts, and also to get rid of some of the people that were considered undesirable to be living in England. And we'll talk about some of those. For instance, starting off with the first colony, there was a few that were established. Carolina became the one after Virginia, and Carolina, it starts out as one colony. Later on, it does get cut into two for North Carolina and South Carolina, but for its establishment, it was just one. It was Carolina. And they had a lot of problems going on. The environment of Carolina was just not that great for these poor English people because it was hot. They were not used to how hot it was, because, the Carolinas are still considered part of the South today. So they get a lot more hot weather, especially during the summer. And Carolina had a lot of mosquitoes. And mosquitoes in the Carolinas at the time carried malaria. So the English were not particularly built for that kind of environment. So a lot of people didn't settle in Carolina to start out with. Over time it does grow, and you'll read about that. And their major city that was first created was Charlestown, and that was created in 1670. Later on, Charlestown, the word, is condensed and shortened to be Charleston, and that's how we know it today as Charleston. But it starts out as Charlestown, to be named after Charles II, of course. Charleston, or Charlestown, also becomes the North American hub, along with New York City, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But the hub of where slavery enters from the Caribbean. It usually, these slave ships would go into Charleston and then sell slaves throughout either the southern colonies or then ship them up to New York City. So it becomes a major hub of the South and also of the slave trade in North America. But later on, because of the differences of how people live and the climate and all that other stuff, it's split into North Carolina and South Carolina, and you'll read about that. New York is a little bit different. It actually starts out as a Dutch colony. It was controlled by the Netherlands. So the Dutch, when we were talking about the Europeans, their goals and all of that, the Dutch were more considered, their aspect of freedom was free trade and free enterprise. That was their major focus. They were very business-minded people. They didn't have as much issues with religion because they were more open and welcoming to differences of religious opinion. Now, they did have their own laws and things, but for the most part, especially those who were considered dissenters in England, often ran away to the Netherlands to get away from persecution. So the Netherlands were pretty open to different ideas of religion. So, and the Dutch also created the first business model, really. The rest of the Europeans, they decided that, the stuff that they liked, they would go and try to sell it elsewhere. Well, the Dutch, they instead decided to go look at the areas they would want to sell to and determine what products were popular there and what the people there actually wanted to buy. And then the Dutch would go get that stuff and sell it to them. So they created the very first business model based on that. And then that went along with those joint stock companies that we talked about in the previous chapters. So they were very business-minded and did very well with it. But most of the time they spent in the Eastern Hemisphere, not so much in the Western Hemisphere. But they did establish a colony that they called New Netherland. And you'll see that a lot, that these Europeans were not too original when they came to naming things. So you'll have a lot of new. New World, New England, New Netherland, New Amsterdam, New York. So there you go. But New Netherland, their capital city was New Amsterdam. But a war breaks out between the Netherlands and England. And England's quickly able to overtake them in some aspects and take over the colony of New Netherland. And Charles II gives it to his brother, Duke of York, who calls it New York. And then the city is renamed to New York City. So that's how we get the names. And the Duke of York wanted to control it as much as possible. The people living there were not too happy about that. They were still wanting that free trade and free enterprise. So some changes do come into New York. One is that they didn't have as much self-rule anymore, but also when the English take over, slavery is allowed in New York. So New York City becomes another hub of the slave trade after that. Pennsylvania is also a little bit different. William Penn was a Quaker. And the religion itself they called themselves the Society of Friends because they had a little bit different beliefs than other Protestants of England. One, they believed that you would be getting God's will directly transmitted to you, and you could understand that if you listened to your own inner light. And then you didn't have to rely so much on the Bible, which is a big no-no for even the Protestants and especially the Church of England at the time. So they were often persecuted and had to flee England. In fact, William Penn and his followers actually go to the Netherlands to get away from persecution before Charles II gives him land in the Americas to pay off the debts, because Charles II owed William Penn a lot of money. So to, one, pay off that debt, and two, get rid of the Quakers, he gave the land to William Penn. Now, it was supposed to be a part of what was West Jersey, but they were also not getting along with the English colonists there, so eventually Penn is granted land elsewhere. In 1681, he gets a land grant, and he calls it Pennsylvania, which is Penn's Wood. So that's where we get that name from. And that paid off Charles II's debts, and a lot of the Quakers eventually end up moving to North America because of that, because they'll have a little bit more religious freedom, not as much persecution, and there's also easier access to land because William Penn puts out ads throughout Europe saying, hey, come settle here, you're going to have, a better life and all that other good stuff. So there's that. And other things about the Quakers that some of the other English colonists didn't like is that when they said society of friends, they really meant it in most aspects. They even wanted to befriend the Native Americans. So in all their dealings with the Native Americans, they tried to be fair and equitable, and they paid for the land that they got from them. And if there was an incident where a Native was put on trial, the jury would be half English and half Native, so that it would be a fair trial. And yeah, they tried to do that throughout their colony, and a lot of the other English colonists at this point are not happy with that because their goal at this point is to get rid of the natives. So there's that. And that's Pennsylvania. I'm not going to say too much about New Jersey because you can read that. It just starts out as East Jersey and West Jersey, but there's really not that much land to it. So it becomes seen that, yeah, we can combine this, and it becomes New Jersey. So there's that. Georgia, on the other hand, is a little bit different as well. One of the things that was going on in England at the time is that if you could not pay your debts, you were often put into prison. It was called debtor's prison. And the problem with that was that the prison started to fill up very quickly. So now the monarchy needed to figure out what to do with these people. Once again, they're poor, they're in prison. We need to, cut down on the people in our prisons and also get rid of people we don't want in England. So what do? We ship them off somewhere. And the major colony that started in was actually Australia. The whole country starts out as one of those colonies where people from usually debtor's prison was sent for their second chance. If you survive, you get your second chance. And that also happens in North America. They start to send off some of these debtors and others that were in prison as well for their second chance. So James Oglethorpe, he takes advantage of this. Not in a bad way, but he wants to create a haven instead for some of these people who were supposed to be getting this second chance from being debtors, or others who had just been persecuted for their religious beliefs or other reasons. He invites them to come settle in Georgia, and he tries to create this haven for them. And the concept was that the English monarchy was following is that Georgia was supposed to be this buffer zone between Carolina and Spanish-owned Florida. So what was happening in Carolina was there was slavery, and the slaves were starting to run away to Florida. And when they got to Florida, they would either be adopted into the Spanish military, and they would be free that way, or the natives in Florida, mostly the Seminoles, would adopt them into the tribe, and they would be free that way. And they became the Black Seminoles. That was their name. And the monarchy thought that the people of Georgia would capture these slaves and send them back to their owners in Carolina. But Oglethorpe and the other people there who were trying to create a haven for persecuted peoples were not about to do that. So it didn't actually happen that way. And eventually, because of that and other issues, Oglethorpe ends up losing the charter. The English crown takes it back over in the 1750s. And then that's when it becomes a royal colony again, and slavery is then brought in into Georgia. The Spanish, we are not going to talk too much about that because that was in a previous chapter, and you can read through what was going on with the Spanish. But overall, what was happening was just the English now, except for the Quakers, were becoming more and more land hungry. And with that, they became greedier and meaner as far as their thoughts towards Native Americans. So the overall outlook was that they needed to get rid of the Native Americans, and they would do pretty much anything that they could to do that. Now, the natives were very willing to trade with the colonists, and there were even middle grounds created for this trading. And then other things would be shared during these middle grounds, like languages, rituals, stuff like that. Tea and rum drinking, gift giving, pipe smoking. The problem with especially the rum drinking, and later on in later American history, the whiskey drinking, is that Native Americans can't hold their liquor. They cannot tolerate the alcohol in their system, and whenever they do drink, they often form treaties that are more advantageous to the English than themselves. So they end up like selling all of their land or giving most of it away while they've been drinking, and that causes a lot of problems later. And wars do break out over that. One in particular, there's several, but Metacom's War was a big one, and the English, being the English, they renamed him, of course, to an English name because, you know, the English want to adopt them and create them into English society. So they called Metacom King Philip instead. So you'll see that as both terms, Metacom's War or King Philip's War, and that's one of the most brutal. Metacom was the son of Massasoit. Massasoit had been one of the chiefs who had helped the English survive. He was a Wampanoag chief. Because of him, the colonists had been able to settle and prosper. But Metacom saw what these colonists were actually doing, so he was not about to befriend them anymore. Instead, he leads his followers to attack 52 of the 90 Puritan settlements, destroying 13 of them, and this was across 4 different colonies: Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Eventually, the English do overtake the natives, and they pretty much kill Metacom, cut off his head, and put it on a stake that's in Plymouth for 25 years, just to show other natives what could happen to them if they go against the English. So it just shows the brutality that really picks up after this. And for the longest time in English, of course, the English were the victors, so they got to tell the story. Even when I was in elementary school, most of the time the Native Americans were depicted as the bad guys, and the English and then the later American settlers were the good guys, which were, not true. But anyway, there was good and bad on both sides. Other things happening because of now the natives are starting to fight back. Some of the colonists get the bright idea that let's just kill them all and all of our problems will be solved. Nathaniel Bacon was one of them. He takes his plan to Sir William Berkeley, who was governor of Virginia at the time. And of course, Berkeley was like, no, this is not a good idea because we still trade with the natives and we kind of depend on them for trade. So let's not do that. But Bacon does not listen and decides to go and attack many of the native villages and kills whoever he comes in contact with. And he gets followers too. He forms his own militia. And they go and they kill men, women, children, elderly, doesn't matter, which causes, of course, the natives to retaliate. So on both sides, you're getting innocents being killed in this war. And Berkeley tries to stop Bacon, so he sends his militia out. And I think Bacon is captured about twice and put in jail. But the people of Jamestown in particular and around Virginia, they protest for his release. So he's released. But he keeps on at it. Berkeley tries to kind of quell this rebellion, and it's called Bacon's Rebellion, by the way, by passing Bacon's laws. And these laws are, some of them, freemen could vote. So what was happening in the colonies? Most of the time they were creating their own self-governments, but only those who owned property could vote. So if you didn't own property, you couldn't make decisions about the area you lived, and a lot of people didn't like that. And Nathaniel Bacon was one of those who was protesting that. So because of this, that's one thing that gets passed. If you were considered a free man, you could vote. They would then hold elections, inaugural elections of legislature. Before this, Berkeley could pretty much appoint members to the legislature. Even though the elections, most of the time you still had to be a property owner in order to be on the legislature. And the representation and taxation, they get to vote before taxes are passed. And this is like the early precursors of democracy in America that later go on. And this was 100 years before the American Revolution. So this is stuff is kind of starts, and then over the next 100 years, it builds till we get to the Revolution. But Bacon still didn't like that. He still tries to go to attack natives, so Berkeley calls in help from the English government, and they send 1,100 troops over to put down the rebellion. Bacon has to go on the run. He catches a fever while he's on the run, and he dies. And because he was the leader of this movement, they no longer had a leader, so the rebellion kind of ended at that point because no one was there to lead it. But what Bacon's rebellion proved was that now not only were the colonists more than willing to kill any natives in sight, they were also willing to kill other colonists to get what they wanted. So that was just another sign of the brutality that was going to come forward. Other changes in freedom. There's a shift in the type of labor from indentured servitude to slavery. So freedom now is not just an ideal or an idea, it becomes a physical embodiment for a person to be considered a slave their entire life. Because before this, most of the labor was indentured servitude. Even Africans who were brought from Africa initially to the colonies were considered indentured servants. And after serving their 4 to 7 years, they would be free. So you would have free Africans living in the colonies, especially up north. Towards the end of the 17th century, towards like the 1660s, 1680s, stuff like that, this starts to really change. And they start to create instead perpetual slavery, unending, lifelong slavery. And in particular, a person from Africa was going to be considered a slave because most indentured servants had been poor English and Irish. So they were able to run away after coming over and going to a different colony and living out the rest of their lives without having to be a servant. And even if they did fulfill their contract of 4 to 7 years, they would be free after that. So these plantation owners realize that they are losing labor and they need a labor source, and they would like to have one that they don't ever lose. So the adoption of slavery, that anyone, especially of from Africa, would become a perpetual slave, meaning lifelong slavery. Because even when Africans were indentured servants, they could not run away and hide because of their skin color. So you also get the introduction of race-based slavery and race-based ideas of a position in society. Before this, it had started off really with the Spanish, with the color of your skin defining, your position of society. But now it really kicks in of being that if you're a darker skin, you're considered a slave, and that kicks off. In Virginia, 1662, they also pass a law that allows slavery to continue. So if the mother is considered a slave, then all her children would also be considered slaves. So it's an unending slavery. And white male plantation owners were more than happy with this. Many of them would often rape slave women just to have more children, even though it was their children. They were slaves that they could use for the rest of their lives. So it just creates this unending cycle going forward. Other laws also pass between now that you have this distinction of what's a slave and also this person's place in society, because once a person is identified as a slave, it's now automatically assumed that this person will not have any rights, any freedoms, because that person's a slave. So any interactions with free people with the slaves have to also be identified. So these laws are starting to be passed, and some of them included Native Americans too, that you were not supposed to have sexual relations of any kind with natives or slaves. And if a male did, then they kind of got a slap on the wrist, you bad, you shouldn't be doing that. But if a woman was to have relations with a slave in particular, that was the most act of abomination. So even if it was a free African, that person, the male, was often put to death because of that interaction. The woman was treated very harshly. She could be whipped, she could be maimed, and these were usually public too. She could be beaten, but for the rest of her life, she would also be an outcast from society, would not be allowed to have many interactions with everyday folk in society. If a white woman had relations with a Native American man, the punishments weren't usually as harsh, but still she would be considered an outcast for the rest of her days in some way. And there was a question in my face-to-face, like, what happened to the children? Sometimes if it was between a white woman and a black man, the children could be put to death because they would be considered abominations. That didn't always happen, but most of the time the punishments were pretty harsh, and the children could be taken away from the mothers and could be considered slaves. Not always, because of the law, that said the condition of the mother. So the mother was free, but still it would be pretty harsh either way. Now, children, white men and Native Americans, those children sometimes were allowed to stay with the mother, but they would also be considered outcasts of society. And sometimes they were taken from the mother and given to other people to, Christianize and make them better. But yeah, there's that. Other laws were put into place, especially black codes, but it was just the question now that we've identified this person as a slave, now we have to also identify who is allowed freedom and who isn't. And slaves also often fell in that who does not get freedoms. But for the most part, slave owners were able to treat their slaves however they wanted to. It was assumed that you wouldn't kill your slave because you'd want to use them as, property or whatever. But for the most part, the slave owner could beat their slaves, whip their slaves. They could cut off a tongue, cut off a hand, kill them if they wanted to. There were no protections for slaves. So they could be treated however. Other things happening in the colonies at the same time, and actually the whole world, the whole known world of the time, wars were breaking out, because now these newfound nations, because they were considered new at the time, where they started to define their borders and things like that, they start to go to war with each other about, who is allowed freedom and what freedom and so on and so forth, and who owns this and who doesn't. But there are several wars that break out, and you'll read about some of them. One of the most influential for North America was what was considered Queen Anne's War. At the time, there was no one sitting on the Spanish throne. It was vacant. So all of these different nations tried to determine who was going to be that monarch, because whoever controlled the Spanish throne controlled the holdings in especially Central and South America, and would get all of that gold and silver that was coming out of it, and so on and so forth. So everybody wanted to put their person on the throne. England, France, the Netherlands, so on and so on. And of course you had the people of Spain fighting as well. But what happens is, and it's called Queen Anne's War, what happens is, because of that, the English really start to come out on top, and they gain a lot of territory because of it. There is a small peace that comes out of it, but it doesn't last very long because these nations are always fighting with each other. But what's happening in North America at the time of Queen Anne's War is we get the Salem witch trials. So all of this stuff is happening at once. This wars between these nations to determine who's going to be controlling the Spanish throne. You have Native Americans attacking the English settlers, English colonists, and at the same time there is some kind of outbreak that's going through the Massachusetts colony. Scientists today think it was a mold that had infected the rye crop, and the rye was then used to make bread. And then the people who ate that would have fits, spasms, uncontrollable body movements. They would be shrieking. It was very painful. A lot of stuff happened. So all this especially started happening, and now, of course, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had to figure out, well, what was causing it. So they landed on that it was witches. It starts out with a slave woman, Tituba, and she and her ancestry is still in question, whether she was half Native or half African is unclear. She probably did come from the Caribbean, was a slave in the Caribbean before she came to North America, but she was a practitioner of voodoo. And voodoo is, before it's like, no, it's not really like that. It's a combination of African religions and African rituals with Christian aspects as well. So it's just a little bit darker than most Christians would like, and has a lot of rituals like sacrifices and things like that just do not align with Christian theology. So it's often looked down upon, especially in these early 17th and or late 17th and early 18th century Massachusetts. So anyway, so the theory is that this slave was showing these two girls aspects of voodoo, and later on these two girls start to have fits, and then they blame her. They say, well, this was Tituba was showing us this, and so it kind of snowballs from there. So in order to save herself, Tituba then has to blame someone else, and then that person blames someone else, and that's it, and it just keeps going from there. But throughout it all, what starts to come up is that these people were dancing in the woods with the devil, or made pacts with the devil, and that's why all of these bad things were happening to the people of the colony. But what it really was is the ones who were accused just started accusing other people that they just didn't like, or that just did not fall within what was expected of Puritan society. Especially if it was a woman, and she did not have a husband, whether she was a widow or not, she was often accused, especially if she owned property, because that was considered a big no-no. Women were not supposed to own properties because potentially she could vote if she owned property. But anyway, so a lot of times it was women, although there wasn't even one case of a dog being accused. Crazy stuff. But a lot of people, over 200, when it was all said and done, were accused. 19 to 20, we say, were killed for it, executed for the crime of witchcraft. And most of them were hung. One guy refused to give his answer whether he was guilty or not, so they pressed him to death. And what that is that they slowly put rocks on his chest until he could no longer breathe. He suffocated. And it took about 3 days for him to actually die. So it was a long process for that one, but that was also used. Now, with that being said, there was over 200 people accused. Some of them did die in jail waiting for their trial to happen. So that's not often mentioned, that more than these 20 people died because of this, but they did. And eventually, even Cotton Mather, who was one of the first accusers, he was like, maybe I was wrong about this. And it took about a year before they started to realize that this is probably not the right thing we should be doing. And then they, let everyone go that was still alive in jail. And then they apologized, Even the Ann Putnam, who was one of the first accusers, later apologizes for her involvement. And even in 1992, I believe it was, Bill Clinton eventually issues a formal apology about the witchcraft trials. So it becomes a larger thing. But overall, what it was is that they were trying to come up with some explanation about what was going on in their colony. And they turned to the answer that it was witchcraft, because that, for them at the time, was the best answer that they had. That all of these things that were happening, the wars with the nations and wars with the Native Americans, and also this outbreak of fits and stuff that was taken through the villages, had to be witchcraft. It had to be some explanation for it. And it was showing that God's displeasure on this colony for not following the edicts properly, and so on and so forth. But that's pretty much the outer lying aspects of the trials. Now, there are transcripts from a whole bunch of the people that were accused, lots of different documents, so you can read about those. In the group assignment, some of you are reading the transcripts of Sarah Bishop, and hers are interesting because her first accuser, she's pretty much accused because she has game night at her house. And some of the youth of the village were involved, and they were there, playing games, so that was corrupting the youth of the village. And then there are other things that they said about her, but yeah, you could pretty much be accused for anything that was considered outside of what was supposed to be norms of society. So yeah, you can read through those, have fun with it. Some of you are writing on your papers about Salem witchcraft trials, so those transcripts are available online, and you can find them pretty easily. But that is pretty much chapter 3, and that's all I've got for that one. If you have any questions at any time, you can always email me. Thanks.